Bill Moore here for Radio Vision Network. I was asked last week to do a more extensive background of who I am and what I do. I started to write some things down, and one of the things I started to put down was retired educator. Well, you're never retired as an educator. I'm a historian. I'm currently the vice president of Camp Olden Civil War Roundtable, which is located in Hamilton, New Jersey. And I'm the past commander of Lincoln Camp 100, Sons of Union Veterans. But more about that later. And this is the second segment of my history for my grandchildren. And I'll be talking to you in the coming weeks about history I want our grandchildren to know. History that either doesn't have time to be covered or has been glossed over. And today's show is a Civil War primer. Okay, historians, you cannot assume that people know what you know. Okay, you must be explicit. You have to spell it out for them. It's your duty, really, to your subject and to your audience. It's something that every good teacher knows. Spell it out. Now let's talk about the American Civil War. Something that I want to lay out right from the very beginning is the fact that both sides were Americans before the war, and at the end, both sides were Americans again. Okay? I want to talk first about the relevance of the war. People always ask me, this is an event that happened over 150 years ago. How is it relevant today? Well, the Civil War marked the end of early U.S. history and ushered in the country that we basically know today. And you ask, how could that be? Well, when you look back at the early history of our country, we had a central government, but sometimes it wasn't a very strong central government. We had some states that were very strong on their own, and today we have a very strong central government with the states, even though they're sovereign states, basically subordinate to the central government. Now let's talk about people, the human aspect of the Civil War. How do we connect the generations to an event that happened over 150 years ago? Let's look first at the revolutionaries who made our country, the revolutionaries who started our country. In 1776, those revolutionaries started the American Revolution, ended the American Revolution in a victory for the new United States. Their sons and their grandsons fought the American Civil War. It was only 84 years between the Revolution and the American Civil War. And to take it a step further, the sons and grandsons of the men who fought the Civil War fought World War II 80 years later. Okay, some of those names I think you'd recognize and connect with. Robert E. Lee, the South's premier general in the Civil War. His father was Light Horse Harry Lee. His father was Washington's cavalry commander. Okay? Simon Bolivar Buckner, a general, Confederate general from the area around Kentucky. His son and namesake, Simon Bolivar Buckner, was killed in action in World War II on the island of Okinawa. He was the highest ranking officer killed, I believe, in World War II on the American side. Many of our grandfathers and our fathers who fought in World War II had grandfathers who fought in the American Civil War. So the relevance is there. Okay? Now let's talk about the cause of the Civil War. The primary cause was secession, states' rights. Secession in 1860 or in 1850 wasn't a new idea. Secession, believe it or not, had first been proposed by New England states as early as the first decades of the 19th century, and was seriously proposed in 1814 as a protest against the War of 1812, which was devastating to the economy of the New England states, who relied on maritime commerce. As late as 1844, Massachusetts, being a prominent state, many presidents from Massachusetts, many politicians, pretty good political clout, pretty good economic clout. In 1844, Massachusetts talked about seceding because they weren't happy with the annexation of Texas into the United States. They saw it as a threat to their political power. They saw it as a threat to the status quo. So by 1860, or the years before 1860, secession was not a new idea. And in the South, the Southerners viewed the war and the succession that started the war as a logical extension of the American Revolution, whose fathers and grandfathers fought that American Revolution. Let's talk a little bit about the participants in the Civil War. We know the names of Lee, we know the names of Grant, Longstreet, and we could go on and on naming generals in the Civil War. Where did they come from? Well, most of those very, very prominent ones were graduates of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And most of those, including Robert E. Lee, U.S. Grant, Longstreet, George Gordon Meade, had their baptism of fire in Mexico during the Mexican War of 1847. Many of them, most of them, distinguished themselves in the actions in Mexico. Now let's talk about, of course, during the Civil War, there were many generals of volunteers, lieutenants and colonels of volunteers who rose to prominence. We're going to break for a commercial, and I'll be right back with primer for the Civil War.
When it's time for Jersey Mike's to give a sub some sizzle, this is the way. The way it's always been. The way it always should be. The way it always will be. Because that's just the way it's supposed to be. Jersey Mike's. Be a sub above.
Simply Gents, located in Marlton, New Jersey, takes care of all your grooming needs, including haircuts, straight razor shaves, massages, facial, manicures, pedicures, and waxing. To find more information or book an appointment, visit us online at www.simplygents.com. The secret weapon of a well-groomed man, Simply Gents.
If you haven't been to Speed Raceway, what are you waiting for? You want to live fast? You want to make every second count? Then grab the family. Round up the guys. Speed Raceway is 100,000 square feet of excitement, whether you're a kid or a kid at heart. Speed Raceway is the place for endless fun all summer long. Log on to speedraceway.com or just get here now.
When it's time for Jersey Mike's to make a really great sub, this is what we do. It's what we've been doing. It's what we've always done. It's what we'll always do. So what are you doing? Jersey Mike's. Be a sub above.
Today's show was brought to you by Alicia Kelly of White Horse RV Center in Williamstown, New Jersey. Alicia is your RV expert. Contact Alicia at alicia@whitehorserv.com or give her a call at 856-262-1717, extension 203. When you think of RV, think Alicia Kelly.
Today's show has been sponsored by Farmers Insurance in Voorhees, New Jersey. To protect your assets and the people you love, call Mike Skoranek, your local Farmers Insurance agent, at 856-336-2553.
We are farmers. Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum.
Okay, we're back with Radio Vision Network, and this is History for Our Grandchildren. I'm Bill Moore, and today's show is dealing with a Civil War primer to explain what the Civil War was basically about, its relevance, and to talk a little bit about the participants in the Civil War. Before we broke for commercial, I was talking about the generals and the higher-ups, the ones that everybody knows day to day, what they did, where they slept, you know, how they felt. And to put it in perspective, the Civil War was a titanic struggle. It lasted from 1861 to 1865. The U.S. Army, prior to the Civil War, only had about 16,000 members. Now let's look at the Civil War. The Civil War produced over 600,000 casualties. But because the pre-Civil War Army was so small, most of the general officers in the North and in the South knew each other, and many of them had been and continued to be, and after the Civil War, were personal friends. Now let's talk about the common soldier, the people that we don't know where they slept every night. We don't know where their headquarters was every day. Who were they? Well, they were men and some women from all walks of life. They were farmers because, remember, the predominant number of farmers in the United States was very high then. There were tradesmen, there were teamsters, there were men from all walks of life. They had one thing in common for the most part, and that was a willingness to volunteer to fight for their country, whether it be North or South. Many of them enlisted in groups, sometimes a family group, sometimes cousins, sometimes men from a particular area. Certain ethnic groups were legitimized by the American Civil War. Prominent among them was the Irish. Okay, the Irish before the Civil War, sometimes when they went to apply for jobs, there would be signs, Irish need not apply. They were subject to much discrimination because they were immigrants, because their accent was a little bit different, because their clothes were a little bit different. They were subject to the same prejudice that anyone who looks a little bit different has been subject to. One of the groups of men who enlisted locally was the 23rd New Jersey Volunteer Infantry. They were known as the Yahoos, and they enlisted for 6 months. Most of them were from the area in and around Burlington County, and we'll talk more about them later. Okay, the Irish fought on both sides very, very bravely during the Civil War for the most part, as did most of the participants in the Civil War. One of their epic battles was the Battle of Fredericksburg, and that's down in Virginia. The Irish were tasked with an almost impossible job, and that was to assault a position held by the Confederates, and it was called Mary's Heights. This was a stone wall that was up a heights. The Irish Brigade had to cross an open area, quite a distance, out in the open and be seen. The Irish Brigade was asked to assault Mary's Hill 7 times that day, and they did so without question. They got, after the battle, there were bodies of the Irish Brigade that were recovered within 25 yards of the Confederate lines. And something I think that is always stuck in my mind, during one of those 7 assaults upon Mary's Hill, a Confederate officer looked down and he remarked to his men who were ensconced behind the stone wall, he said, "Here comes that damn green flag again." Well, what was that damn green flag? That green flag was the regimental flag of the Irish Brigade, the brigade flag, if you will. And it was the flag of Old Ireland. It was the harp ensconced in gold on a green background, and it could be seen all over the battlefield. Well, when he made that remark, many of the Confederates behind that stone wall on Mary's Hill were Irish by birth. They stood up from behind the stone wall during that charge, gave 3 cheers for their Irish brethren, and I'm quite certain that many of them had brothers, cousins, had family on the opposing side. They gave that 3 cheers, got down behind the stone wall, and shot the attacking Irish Brigade to pieces. The Irish Brigade was wasted that day at Fredericksburg. A little bit later in the war, again near Fredericksburg, the local outfit, 23rd New Jersey. 23rd New Jersey fought at Salem Church. They came on the battlefield, and so the story goes, they drove the opposing regiment off the field. The opposing regiment regrouped, came back on the field, and drove the 23rd New Jersey off the field. This was during their brief 6 months in the Union Army. This was their major battle. And interestingly enough, in the 1890s, as they grew older, they wanted to put a monument on the battlefield at Salem Church. And they raised money for a monument to be erected in honor of what you would think would be the 23rd New Jersey. And when you look at that monument, it's still down there, but it's one of the unique monuments in the Civil War. Because on one side of the monument is dedicated to the 23rd New Jersey and the men who had fallen at Salem Church. The other side of the monument is dedicated to the Alabama regiment that they fought at Salem Church. They thought so much of these men, and the feelings had calmed down after the war, that they were interested in dedicating one side of their monument to the Alabama regiment that they fought. We're going to take a quick break for a commercial, and I'll be right back with Civil War Primer and more on the causes and the participants and some of the first in the Civil War.
Today's show is sponsored by Hargrove Demolition, your demolition experts. Hargrove is a family-owned and operated business right here in the southern New Jersey area, bringing you 45 years of demolition expertise. Hargrove has all your demolition needs, from emergency demolition service to demolition equipment rental. Hargrove is one of the state-approved recycling facilities right here in the southern New Jersey area. No job is too big or too small for Hargrove Demolition. Contact them today at one of their 3 locations.
When it's time for Jersey Mike's to give a sub some sizzle, this is the way. The way it's always been. The way it always should be. The way it always will be. Because that's just the way it's supposed to be. Jersey Mike's. Be a sub above.
If you haven't been to Speed Raceway, what are you waiting for? You want to live fast? You want to make every second count? Then grab the family. Round up the guys. Speed Raceway is 100,000 square feet of excitement, whether you're a kid or a kid at heart. Speed Raceway is the place for endless fun all summer long. Log on to speedraceway.com or just get here now.
When we make Beyond Natural dry dog and cat foods, we start with real meat as the first ingredient. We leave out corn, wheat, and soy. And we own where our dry food is made. 100%. Can other brands say all that? For nutrition you can trust and your pet will enjoy. Does your food go beyond? Learn more at purinabeyond.com.
Extra Innings is the nation's premier indoor baseball and softball training center, featuring indoor batting cages, 7 multi-use tunnels, and training rooms. Extra Innings can provide professional instruction, private and group lessons, and the best year-round clinics. Along with a nationally recognized pro shop that features the latest and widest selection of equipment and apparel, our experienced staff can provide you with the right instruction and help you find the best equipment for your ability and budget. Extra Innings, where the game never ends.
Today's show has been sponsored by More Than Gifts. Come see our new location in Marlton, New Jersey. Not just gifts, but more.
Okay, we're back with Radio Vision Network. Bill Moore here with History for Our Grandchildren. And today's show is Civil War Primer. I mentioned earlier that there were over 600,000 casualties. The majority of those casualties were from sickness and disease rather than battlefield wounds. But the battlefield wounds that were suffered were absolutely appalling in the light of modern medical techniques. I want to talk about a little bit of the reasons for that. The small arms that were used during the Civil War progressed rapidly during the war. The technology had increased. At the beginning of the war, most of the soldiers on both sides were armed with smoothbore muskets. They were of 69 caliber. They fired a ball about the size of the segment of your thumb. When this ball struck you, it did appalling damage. One of the reasons also was the fact that the tactics used in the early part of the war were Napoleonic tactics. They dated from the beginning of the 19th century and before. Regiments were marched out on the field, lined up within less than 100 yards, and fired away at each other in an open field. You can imagine the casualties. You can imagine the devastation. You can imagine the confusion caused by the black powder smoke, by the shouts of those wounded and dying, by the exhortations of officers, attack, retreat, all kinds of drum rolls which signaled men to do certain things. Okay, one of the favorite small arms of both the Irish Brigade and many of the New Jersey volunteer regiments was the smoothbore musket. And the smoothbore musket was loaded with a regulation load of what they referred to as buck and ball. It had one large ball of about 64 to 65 caliber and 3 or 4 buckshot of about 30 caliber. Well, this increased the chances of hitting someone, particularly at those close ranges within 100 yards. And the general of the Irish Brigade, General Marr, requested that his men have the smoothbore muskets with the buck and ball, because the Irish Brigade would come in at the double quick, come onto the battlefield, get up close to their opponents, and level a devastating fire of buck and ball. Very reminiscent, going back to earlier times, Celtic warriors' trait to get in close, just as the Highlanders tried to do at Culloden, but were unsuccessful in an earlier war. But let's get back to the Civil War and let's talk a little bit about what happened. As the Civil War progressed, muskets were rifled, breech loaders were used by cavalry, and you had an increase in the efficiency of the small arms. So you can see that casualties did increase. Civil War medicine was behind the mass production of firearms, which was one of the innovations of the Civil War. I want to talk and give you a couple battlefield vignettes or a view of what happened on a battlefield. Many people have heard of Gettysburg, and I focus on the third day at Gettysburg, and I focus on a tremendous artillery bombardment by the Confederate artillery, probably the largest artillery bombardment before or since on the North American continent. After this artillery bombardment, you had between 10 and 12,000 Confederates line up in parade formation and attack the center of the Union line, which was up on a ridge, a very good position General Meade had. They marched across open ground for well over a mile, as if on parade. The Union Army fired everything that they had, cannon fire. As the Confederates approached, they loaded their cannons with grape shot, which made each artillery piece a huge shotgun. As holes were blasted in the Confederate ranks, they closed ranks and kept on. When they got within range, they came at the double quick, and some Confederates even made it into the Union lines. Confederates being led by General Lew Armistead, and I have to think that he had to have been one of the bravest general officers on either side during the Civil War. Lew Armistead led part of Pickett's charge on foot. He had his general's uniform on, he had his general's hat on. Anybody on the battlefield would recognize him as a general. As they got closer to the Union lines, Lew Armistead took off his hat, put it on the top of his sword, and exhorted his men forward. They actually succeeded in capturing Alonzo Cushing's battery, but there were too few men left to hold that position. Lew Armistead was mortally wounded in that attack, and as he lay dying, propped up against one of the cannons that his men had just captured, some of his dying words were he asked how his friends in the Union Army were. And one of his good friends was Winfield Scott Hancock. They were friends before the war, and he wanted to know if he was all right. This was I think, an inside look at what, even though the Civil War was a titanic struggle, it was basically a family squabble. These men on both sides, particularly the officers, knew each other. They had socialized. They had gone to school together. They had fought in the Mexican War together. So there was a common bond, even though that bond had been split asunder by the politics of the American Civil War. Another vignette that I want to bring up is the Battle of Antietam. Antietam, September 17th, 1861, saw the largest casualties in any American battle in history. Yes, even when you consider the battles of World War II, the Normandy landing, okay, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima in the Pacific, which was the largest fight that the U.S. Marines were ever in. Over 60,000 U.S. Marines participated. Even Okinawa, as the American forces got closer to the Japanese home islands, the Japanese fought harder. And this is where Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was killed, the son of a Civil War general. At Antietam, the Irish Brigade was there, and they were asked to come onto the field. They advanced at the double quick. And after the battle, there were at least 4,000 Confederate dead in what was termed Bloody Lane. Most of those 4,000 Confederate dead were laid low by buck and ball by weapons that were used by the Irish Brigade. Okay? What were some Civil War first? Well, one of the first things, mass transportation. And the Civil War spurred development of what just a year or so after the war became the Transcontinental Railroad. Troops were shuttled from place to place by railroads. Railroad centers became strategic places to be captured. Rail lines were targeted by cavalry raids on both sides to destroy those rail lines. Aerial spotting was a first. There were balloon corps in both the Union and Confederate armies. One of the Roeblings, prominent in the industrial fame of Roebling, New Jersey, was in the U.S. Balloon Corps. Submarines were employed. The Hundley, everybody has heard of the Hundley, or many people have. She was employed in Charleston Harbor, and within the last few years was raised, sadly enough, with her crew still in the Hundley, and they were given a proper burial by men in blue and gray, reenactors who stood guard, honor guard, the night before their burial. Mass production was the Civil War first. You had mass production of firearms. You had mass production of shoes, which had hitherto been a cottage industry. Firearms. Each piece had been individually hand fit. Now you had mass production so that a part made here would fit another part made there. All the parts were standardized within certain tolerances. The beginnings of what would later become Henry Ford's empire, the production line for automobiles. You had Ironclad Warships. That day in Hampton Roads, off Hampton Roads, Virginia, where the Monitor and the Merrimack met and dueled, ushered in a new era of naval warfare. You had ironclad warships with revolving turrets. You had armor many inches thick. They were devastating to the conventional wooden warships of the day. One of the U.S. Navy's best warships was sunk in a matter of minutes by the Merrimack. Okay? At the end of the Civil War, the Union Monitor program had built 3 or 4 different classes of monitors. They were the equal or better than that of any Navy in the world. And for those of you that know a little bit about history, you know how prominent the British Navy was at the time. These monitors were better than anything the British had. They were better than anything the French had or any other Navy of the world. So you had an awful lot of first. The Civil War ushered in what, again, I want to repeat and make certain, was our modern era. I want to thank you, folks, for viewing History for Our Children. This has been Bill Moore, and we've been talking about a Civil War primer. Tune in next week, and I'll be with you talking about another aspect of American history for our grandchildren, things that we want our grandchildren to know. Thank you again. I look forward to meeting with you again.